And welcome to Western Civ, episode 164, Castaways. Last time we followed Columbus, as his fourth and final voyage of discovery turned into a contest for sheer survival. Columbus battled storm after storm, then natives and, almost, sharks. Through it all, it became increasingly clear that Columbus was also losing his grip on reality. Believing that he was trapped in an epic quest, fighting to get to heaven, Columbus interpreted each challenge as though sent by the devil himself. Finally, Columbus realized he was simply too old to continue, too unwell, and resolved to return to Spain. After yet another storm wrecked 2 of his 4 ships, he determined to sail for Spain with the 2 remaining vessels, said vessels being in hardly better condition than those that had previously sank. Little did Columbus know, however, his return to Spain was much, much further away than he expected. The survivors set sail on the 2 remaining ships on April 16, 1503. Columbus essentially retraced his initial course, sailing back along the coast of Central and then South America, until docking at Cape Tiburon, Colombia, on May the 1st. Columbus's plan was then to turn north and, hopefully, catch the trade winds home. On May the 10th, they passed the Cayman Islands and continued on towards Cuba, in an absolutely sorry state. Quote, "As we lay here at anchor 10 leagues from Cuba, suffering greatly from hunger, because we had nothing to eat but biscuits and a little oil and vinegar, and exhausted by working 3 pumps day and night to keep the vessels afloat, for they were ready to sink from the holes made by the shipworms. There came on at night a great storm, in which Bermuda, being unable to ride it out, fouled us, and broke our stern. Nor did she get off whole, but smashed her stern into the helm," end quote. Then, you guessed it, after even that, another storm hit. Columbus desperately wanted to continue north, but that clearly was not going to happen at this point. And even Columbus admitted, quote, "The rough sea had the upper hand, and I had to turn back without sail. I threw out anchor at an island where I lost 3 anchors at a single stroke, and at midnight, when it seemed the world was about to disappear, the cables of the other ship gave way, and it bore down on me, so that it was a wonder that we were not smashed into splinters. It was the anchor and the way it held that, after God saved me," end quote. When the weather cleared, he tried to continue north, but the rigging was absolutely shot. For 8 days, the ship just sort of drifted, until finally, Columbus was able to get the vessel to Jamaica. At this point, one of the 2 vessels was taking on water so quickly that they could not even bail it fast enough. The men clung to the floating disaster that was their ship, until, quote, "With great toil we continued in this state until daybreak. We made a harbor in Jamaica named Porto Bueno," end quote. Columbus continued to limp east until he reached St. Anne's Bay, where they beached their ships. They were safe and alive for now. But the harsh reality was obvious. Their ships were ruined, and Columbus, his brother, his son, and the rest of the crew were castaways, marooned in Jamaica. Luckily, quote, "the Indians of that country, who proved to be a kind and gentle people, presently came in canoes to barter their wares and provisions," end quote. Columbus determined he would barter for a canoe, and send some of the survivors to Hispaniola where they could get help. As expected, no one initially volunteered for the trip, as it meant crossing around 124 miles of open sea in canoes. If literally any weather at all hit them, they were dead. Finally, one of Columbus's most stalwart commanders, Diego Mendes de Segura, volunteered. He would lead one canoe, while the other would be captained by a fellow Genoese. Each canoe would carry 6 Spaniards and several native paddlers. After an early misstep, the first cadre of native paddlers apparently intended to murder their passengers. The 2 canoes finally set out near the end of April. The men in the canoes commenced paddling for 5 days and 4 nights in order to reach Hispaniola. While the men on the canoes faced the dangers of the crossing, the men left behind could only languish in inactivity, constantly worried that the natives might sense their weakness and attack. Many of them, barely loyal to Columbus when all this started, began to openly talk of rebelling against the admiral of the ocean sea. Columbus did little to inspire confidence. Far from being able to go along in one of the canoes, he was so ill he could barely get out of bed, lamenting, quote, "Who would believe that a poor foreigner could rebel under such circumstances against your highness, without cause or aid of another prince, alone in the world, surrounded by your vassals and subjects, having your sons at royal court? I came to serve at the age of 28, and now I have not a single hair left that is not white, and my body is infirm and broken. All that belonged to me was taken and sold, and from my brothers, even their clothes, without my being heard or received, to my great dishonor. One has to trust that these things were not done by your royal order." End quote. Descending into melodrama, on July 7th, 1503, he wrote, "I am desperate. I used to weep for others. Now may heaven show me mercy, and the earth weep for me. As for temporal things, I do not possess even a penny to give to charity. As for spirituality, I have been stranded here in the Indies, isolated in this torment, sick, expecting death every day, and encircled by 1,000,000 savages. Filled with cruelty, our enemies, so far from the holy sacraments and holy church that she would forget this soul if it were separated from my body here. May whoever possesses charity, truth, and justice weep for me. I did not set out on this voyage to earn honors and riches. That is certain, because hope of that is already dead. I came to your highness with an honest intention and good zeal, and I am not lying. Humbly I beseech your holiness, if God pleased to release me from here, to permit me to go to Rome and other places of pilgrimage. May the Holy Trinity preserve and increase your life in high state." End quote. Throughout the end of 1503, more and more men mutinied and indicated they would not lift a finger to save Columbus. Making matters worse, this mutinous group started conducting its own affairs with the locals. As 1503 gave way to 1504, the local natives were bringing less and less of their supplies to trade with Columbus and his few loyalists. Eventually, those loyalists realized they were trapped. They could either starve to death or leave their camp, constructed out of the remains of the ships, to fight the natives for what they needed. But if they did that, they would have to leave Columbus alone, undefended. Running out of options, Columbus fell back on magic. Well, okay. He hoped to convince the natives that it was magic, but in reality it was just math and science. Columbus was able to study an astronomical table that, conveniently, included a list of lunar eclipses. he determined one such eclipse would occur on February 29, 1504, only a short period away. While he could not predict the exact time, given the time difference between Jamaica and Spain, he would have to make the best of it. So Columbus summoned the local natives to a feast on February 29, 1504. In the middle of the feast, he told the natives that God was on his side, that if they continued to treat him and his loyalists poorly, that he would have no choice but to punish them. To prove this, Columbus claimed that God would show a sign. Good-naturedly, the natives seemed to have nodded along, joking. Suddenly it happened. The Earth's shadow expanded until it covered the entire moon. The natives were awestruck and took to crying out. Apparently, Columbus could control the heavens. So Columbus quickly calmed them. He told them that God had pardoned them, so long as they altered their behavior. Far from refusing to trade with Columbus, the natives from that point onward began bringing him everything he needed as tribute. Once again, science saved the day. In early March, another mutiny broke out. This one gained strength until it seemed certain to undo Columbus once and for all. Then, just in the nick of time, a sail appeared on the horizon. It belonged to a rescue caravel sent, somewhat begrudgingly, by Nicolas de Ovando, the new governor of Hispaniola, who had banned Columbus from the island when he randomly showed up a year earlier. In what must have been an odd moment, the captain of the ship dropped anchor and came ashore. There he deposited 2 barrels of wine and a slab of salt pork before abruptly informing the men that his one ship could not transport them back to Hispaniola. Instead, he told them that a rescue ship would be sent as soon as Ovando could spare it. Until then, I guess, enjoy the wine and the pork. The men that were so happy, they reneged on the mutiny immediately. Finally, by May 1504, said rescue ship arrived. Interestingly, Ovando didn't send it. Rather, it turned out that Mendes, one of the 2 captains sent in the canoes, had spent nearly a year waiting for a ship to arrive from Spain that he could, using the promise of Columbus's resources, purchase and use for the rescue. Ovando appears to have never had any intention of rescuing Columbus. In fact, as the ship set sail to Jamaica, Ovando told Mendes that Columbus remained banned from the island and could not return to Santo Domingo. As the ship returned with Columbus and his marooned men, Mendes set off for Spain, eager to tell the king and queen what he had witnessed. While in Hispaniola for nearly a year, Mendes witnessed so many acts of cruelty perpetuated by Ovando that it put whatever Columbus had done during the 3rd voyage to shame. Once more, it seemed that a change in governor did little to change the outcome in the New World. Those in charge of their army of criminals and scoundrels looking for easy gold in the New World often had to resort to brutalizing their men and enslaving the locals to get anything close to the semblance of a working colony. Again, it was far from the idyllic virgin world Queen Isabella had once dreamt of. Speaking of Queen Isabella, around the same time, so spring of 1504, she fell ill and as a result cut back on her official duties. This would not bode well for Columbus, since Isabella had always favored him. On June 28, 1504, Columbus reached Hispaniola. Then, On September 12th, Columbus left the Caribbean, bound for Spain for the last and final time. The ship then hit a storm and had to return to Santo Domingo. I know what you're thinking. Is Columbus cursed? Honestly, I'd have to say yes at this point. Regardless, the crew switched ships and left for Spain. This time they made it, arriving in southern Spain. Columbus had been gone for nearly 2.5 years. Somewhat depressingly, he then started telling anyone who would listen that he had finally found India. Despite all his observations, from Venezuela to Cuba to Panama, Columbus still had no idea where he had been. To his son, who would write extensively about Columbus for the rest of his life, Columbus remained a tragic figure. Only his singular vision to Ferdinand, to keep the dream of a westward passage to India alive, always dependent on the whims of the Spanish royalty. Columbus could never behave precisely as he wanted. At least that was his son's perspective. It was now November 1504. Columbus's plan remained to see Queen Isabella again, reconcile himself with the Spanish crown, and undertake a 5th voyage to the New World. Like so many of his dreams, it was not to be. On November the 26th, 1504, Queen Isabella died. She was 53 years old. With her death, any dream that Columbus might once more set sail ended. Her death crushed Columbus. Quote, her death caused the admiral much grief, for she had always aided and favored him, while the king he always found somewhat reserved and unsympathetic to his projects, unquote. Isabella had long favored Columbus more than her husband. Everyone knew that. In fact, both Columbus's son and Las Casas recognized it. Las Casas observed, quote, I know not why or with what motive, not only failed to show him any material sign of gratitude, but also, while very complimentary in what he said, did his level best to ensure that Columbus's route to advancement was blocked. I never managed to get to the bottom of this dislike. By this dislike, he means Ferdinand. Unless it was that the king paid more attention than was warranted to the false witness brought against the admiral by those at court, who were jealous of him, end quote. It is hard to imagine that final meeting between King Ferdinand and Columbus. On one side, you have a man who had clearly already moved on from Columbus, probably taking the meeting as simply a courtesy. On the other, the aged Columbus, reminding Ferdinand of his exploits, begging for another chance to travel across the ocean seas, while it was obvious to everyone in the room he could hardly travel across Spain. Regardless, Ferdinand wasn't having it. His refusal is illustrative of how differently Columbus and the Spanish monarchs saw their relationship. Columbus believed that they were partners, equals in the exploration of the New World. Ferdinand saw Columbus as a servant to be commanded. He could remove him whenever he wished, nothing less, nothing more. Columbus tried again to paint the rosiest image he could of his exploits. But his excuses were weak. Especially poor was his excuse for enslaving the natives, which even Queen Isabella had instructed him not to do. Columbus claimed that this was a temporary measure to teach enough natives Spanish so that the dream of converting them to all Christianity could be realized. It was a weak excuse, to say the least. Making matters worse, Isabella's death, and then Ferdinand's subsequent decision to marry the niece of the King of France, who was 18-year-old, by the way, compared to Ferdinand's 54 years, threw a monkey wrench into the question of dynastic succession. Don't forget, throughout Isabella's life, she had continued to be Queen of Castile. Now who was Queen of Castile? Ferdinand and Isabella had an heir, Juana, but she was often infirm. Into this maelstrom stepped Columbus, eager to have his rights restored. Ultimately, though, none of this mattered. Columbus was dying. In fact, the last time that King Ferdinand saw the old explorer, Columbus couldn't even get out of bed. There really was no question of him setting sail again. Amazingly, even until the end, Columbus took no joy in his discoveries, always believing that he was right, that the route to India lay just right around the corner. He failed to recognize the magnitude of what he had done. He languished in Valladolid, suffering from chronic arthritis, chills, headaches, nausea, and diarrhea. Modern physicians believe that Columbus was suffering from reactive arthritis, which is caused by infection. Columbus dictated his will on May the 19th, 1506, and died the next day, May 20th, 1506, surrounded by his sons, Ferdinand and Diego. He was 54 years old. In 1509, 3 years after he died, his remains were removed to a monastery outside Seville. 2 years after that, they were moved, along with the remains of his brother Bartholomew, to the Cathedral of Santa Maria in Santo Domingo, Hispaniola. In 1697, Spain ceded part of Hispaniola, now Haiti, to France. To prevent the French from getting his remains, the Spanish moved them to Havana, Cuba. Yet, in 1877, when the remains were tested, they proved to be those of Diego Columbus, his son. It was later determined that Columbus's actual remains were still in Santo Domingo. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, Spain transported what they thought were his remains back to Cadiz and ultimately to Seville. Today, the matter remains debated. Spain insists that Columbus lies and rests at Seville. The Dominican Republic claims he's still in Santo Domingo. We may never know. Ironically, I have to say, I find this a somewhat fitting end for an explorer who remains mostly famous today for not knowing where he actually was. No discussion of Columbus would be complete without at least mentioning two topics: the Colombian Exchange and Columbus Day. I said at the outset I believe it was wrong and unfair to blame one man, Columbus, for literally every ill eventually visited upon the New World by Europeans. The process of change that begins after 1492 is referred to as the Colombian Exchange. Hundreds of millions of years ago, all the continents were one. This giant continent is referred to as Pangaea. As recently as 125 million years ago, Eurasia was still joined to North America. It wasn't until around 30 million years ago that Pangaea began to break apart. From that point onward, the ecosystems of the Americas became decidedly different from Asia, Europe, and Africa. We will talk more about this when we get into Native American civilizations, but suffice it to say that the separation created almost two completely different planets. The world in 1492 was a completely different place from what we know today. The tomato was unknown in Italian cooking. Chocolate only existed in Central and South America. Tobacco was deeply woven into the spiritual lives of Native Americans, but unknown to Europeans. Native Americans knew nothing of horses, the addition of which would revolutionize the lives of those living on the Great Plains. The two-way transmission that began in 1492 dramatically changed the lives of everyone on the planet. The slow-moving process is known as the Colombian Exchange. It was first invented by Alfred Crosby, a professor at the University of Texas in Austin in 1972. Within a couple of decades, Crosby's insights gave rise to a new way of considering the Colombian legacy. Quote, "When Europeans first touch the shores of the Americas, Old World crops such as wheat, barley, rice, turnips had not traveled west across the Atlantic. And New World crops such as maize, white potatoes, sweet potatoes, and manioc had not traveled east to Europe." End quote. These vast differences extended to animal life as well. Quote, "In the Americas, there were no horses, cattle, sheep, or goats. They were all animals of Old World origin." End quote. I mean, in fact, with few exceptions, the New World had honestly no domesticated animals at all. No chickens, no cattle, until Columbus arrived. And when he did arrive, their presence changed. Hunting, eating, and ultimately the migratory habits and the tribal structures of all the indigenous people who made use of these animals for food, labor, and companionship. Horses, sticking with this example, dramatically changed the lives of many Native Americans. In some ways, these changes were good. Consider the list of foods that came from the New World, from the Americas to Europe. We're talking about things like white potatoes, sweet potatoes, maize, corn, and cassava, while Europe sent things like wheat, turnips, barley, apples, believe it or not, and rice to the Americas. These things were unknown on opposite sides of the Atlantic in 1492. But animals and humans also brought pathogens unknown to the native peoples of the Americas. Smallpox, measles, chickenpox, and influenza all ravaged native cultures, bringing devastation that even Europeans with their swords and guns could not replicate. Not to mention the alcohol that Europeans came with, which devastated many native cultures just as much, if not more, than European firearms. Ultimately, though, what you need to take away from all of this is not that the native cultures of the Americas were inferior. And that's why they were, devastated by these horsemen of the apocalypse. No. The reality is that the attack that came was simply too novel and too sudden. Had the roles been reversed, the outcome would have been the same. And that leaves Columbus Day. Many in the United States today believe that Columbus Day was celebrated by the Founding Fathers, who then wrote it as a holiday into both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, making Columbus Day sacrosanct for all time. Unfortunately, that is not remotely true. Only in 1937 did President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaim Columbus Day a national holiday, largely as a result of intense lobbying by the Knights of Columbus, an influential Catholic fraternal organization. Thus, Columbus Day has been a holiday in the United States for less than 100 years. Recently, it has become somewhat vogue, I suppose, to disparage Columbus Day as much as possible. While, again, it seems unfair to heap every misdeed of all the Europeans on one guy's shoulders, not only, to be fair, was Columbus not a redeemable person, but, detracting from Columbus, and hence from Columbus Day, is definitely not a new phenomenon. Let's face it, knocking Columbus Day and Columbus has existed as a pastime literally since his first voyage. Bobadilla, after all, undertook a protracted campaign to disparage Columbus, oftentimes seeking out only negative evidence about the man. As I mentioned at the very outset of all these episodes, Columbus's main biographer, and man whom I have cited more than any other, and who is getting his own episode coming up here, including Columbus, by the way, Bartolomé de Casas, hated, and I do mean that in all caps, hated Columbus and blamed him for everything that went wrong in the New World. Las Casas, the first priest to be ordained in the New World, set out his litany of complaints against Columbus in 1492 in extreme detail. Las Casas estimated, quote, "The despotic and diabolical behavior of the Christians has, over the last 40 years, led to the unjust and totally unwarranted deaths of more than 12 million souls, women and children among them." End quote. Many people today question his figures, but even more likely estimates are stark. Don't forget, of the 250,000 Native Americans under Spanish rule in 1493, most in Hispaniola, by 1500, only 40,000 remained, and decades later, only a few hundred survived. And the reason? Well, to quote Las Casas, pure and simple greed. The English and Dutch greedily gobbled up Las Casas' complaints, believing it gave them moral reason to reject the Pope's decree that the New World belonged to Spain and, ultimately, to a much lesser extent, Portugal. Initially, in the United States, Columbus became a point of national pride, a means to create a new identity. Not only did Americans name both the capitals of South Carolina and Ohio Columbus, but in 1871, the United States Congress declared that the U.S. capital was the District of Columbus. Somewhat ironically, then, the United States has become, in some places, the greatest Columbus detractor. I suppose the good news is that if you do not like Columbus and prefer to celebrate Indigenous Persons Day, which does have much to commend to it, though I cannot settle that debate myself. But if that's your goal, you are not new to history. From Las Casas to Bobadilla to Rodin, you're in good company of people who did not think that Columbus was the proverbial bee's knees. Since he arrived back in Spain after the first voyage, someone has always hated Christopher Columbus. To end today, however, I want to quote the historian Lawrence Bergreen, again, to whom I'm greatly indebted for his excellent book on Columbus, link in the show notes. Check it out. Quote, "For all the scorn Columbus engendered, his 4 voyages constitute one of the greatest adventure stories in history. Although he was not the first explorer to glimpse or visit the distant shores of the Americas, His was the discovery that permanently planted the reality of the new world in the imagination and political schemes of the old. Columbus forever changed the idea of what a European empire could be. He had the vision and at times the delusion to imagine and to persuade himself and others that he had found something immense, important, and lasting. End quote. Next time, we shift gears from Columbus into a lengthy episode on John Cabot. If you're interested in more content in the interim, check out the website westerncivpodcast.com or consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast.